The Daughter of Time, Chapter 7. Grant had switched off his bedside light that night and was half asleep when a voice in his mind said, "But Thomas More was Henry VIII." This brought him wide awake. He flicked on the light again. What the voice had meant, of course, was that Thomas More and Henry VIII were one and the same person, but that in that business of putting personalities into pigeonholes according to reigns, Thomas More belonged to the reign of Henry VIII. Grant lay looking at the pool of light in his lamp that his lamp threw on the ceiling, and reckoned, if Thomas More was Henry VIII's chancellor, then he must have lived through the whole of Henry VII's long reign, as well as Richard III's. There was something wrong somewhere. He reached for More's history of Richard III. It had as preface a short life of More, which he had not bothered to read. Now he turned to it to find out how More could have been both Richard III's historian and Henry VIII's chancellor. How old was More when Richard succeeded? He was 5. When that dramatic council scene had taken place at the Tower, Thomas More had been 5 years old. He had been only 8 when Richard died at Bosworth. Everything in that history had been hearsay. And if there was one word that a policeman loathed more than another, it was hearsay, especially when it applied to evidence. He was so disgusted that he flung the precious book on the floor before he remembered that it was the property of the public library and his only by grace and for 14 days. More had never known Richard III at all. He had indeed grown up under a Tudor administration. That book was the Bible of the whole historical world on the subject of Richard III. It was from that account that Holinshed had taken his material, and from that Shakespeare had written his except that More believed what he wrote to be true, it was of no more value than what the soldier said. It was what his cousin Laura called snow on their boots, a gospel true event seen by someone other than the teller. That More had a critical mind and an admirable integrity did not make the story acceptable evidence. A great many otherwise admirable minds had accepted that story of the Russian troops passing through Britain. Grant had dealt too long with the human intelligence to accept as truth someone's report of someone's report, and what that someone remembered to have seen or been told. He was disgusted. At the first opportunity, he must get an actual contemporary account of the events of Richard's short reign. The public library could have Sir Thomas More back tomorrow and be damned to their 14 days. The fact that Sir Thomas was a martyr and a great mind did not cut any ice at all with him, Alan Grant. He, Alan Grant, had known great minds so uncritical that they would believe a story that would make a con man blush for shame. He had known a great scientist who was convinced that a piece of butter muslin was his great Aunt Sophia's because an illiterate medium from the back streets of Plymouth told him so. He had known a great authority of the human mind and its evolution who had been taken for all he had by an incurable knave because he judged for himself and not on police stories. As far as he, Alan Grant, was concerned, there was nothing so uncritical or so damned silly as your great mind. As far as he, Alan Grant, was concerned, Thomas More was washed out, canceled, deleted, and he, Alan Grant, was beginning from scratch again tomorrow morning. He was still illogically fuming when he fell asleep, and he woke fuming. Do you know that your Sir Thomas More knew nothing about Richard III at all? He said accusingly to the Amazon the moment her large person appeared in the doorway. She looked startled, not at his news, but his ferocity. Her eyes looked as if they might brim with tears at another rough word. Because, of course, he knew, she protested. He lived then. He was 8 when Richard died, Grant said, relentless, and all he knew was what he had been told. Like me, like you, like Will Rogers of blessed memory, there is nothing hallowed at all about Sir Thomas More's history of Richard III. It is all a damned piece of hearsay and a swindle. Aren't you feeling so well this morning? She asked anxiously. Do you think you've got a temperature? I don't know about a temperature, but my blood pressure's way up. Oh, dear, dear, she said, taking this literally. And you were doing so very well. Nurse Ingram will be so distressed. She has been boasting about your good recovery. That the midget should have found him a subject for boasting was a new idea to Grant, but it was not one that gave him any gratification. He resolved to have a temperature in earnest if he could manage it, just to score off the midget. But the morning visit of Marta distracted him from his experiment in the power of mind over matter. Marta, it seemed, was pluming herself on his mental health very much, as the midget was pluming herself on his physical improvement. She was delighted that her pokings about with James in the print shop had been so effective. Have you decided on Perkin Warbeck, then? She asked. No, not Warbeck. Tell me, what made you bring me a portrait of Richard III? There's no mystery about Richard, is there? No, I suppose we took it as an illustration of the Warbeck story. No, wait a moment. I remember James turned it up and said, if he's mad about faces, there's one for him, he said. He said that's the most notorious murder in history, and yet his face, in my estimation, the face of a saint. A saint, Grant said, and then remembered something. Over-conscientious, he said. What? Nothing. I was just remembering my first impressions of it. Is that how it seemed to you, a face of a saint? She looked across at the picture propped up against the pile of books. I can't see it against the light, she said, and picked it up for closer scrutiny. He was suddenly reminded that to Marta, as to Sergeant Williams, faces were a professional matter. The slant of an eyebrow, the set of a mouth, was just as much evidence of character to Marta as to Williams. Indeed, she actually made herself faces to match the characters she played. Nurse Ingram thinks he's dreary. Nurse Darrell thinks he's a horror. My surgeon thinks he's a polio victim. Sergeant Williams thinks he's a born judge. And Matron thinks he's a soul in torment. Marta said nothing for a little while. Then she said, it's odd, you know. When you first look at it, you think it's a mean, suspicious face, even cantankerous. But when you look at it a little longer, you find that it isn't what James meant by being saint-like. That it isn't like that at all. It's a quiet calm. It is really quite a gentle face. Perhaps that is what James meant by being saint-like. No, I don't think so. What he meant was the subservience to conscience. Whatever it is a face, isn't it? Not just a collection of organs for seeing, breathing, and eating with. A wonderful face with very little alteration, It might be a portrait of Lorenzo the Magnificent. You don't suppose that it is Lorenzo and that we're considering the wrong man altogether? Of course not. Why should you think that? Because nothing in the face fits the facts of history, and pictures have got shuffled before now. Oh, yes, of course they have. But that is Richard all right, the original, or what it's supposed to have been to be the original at Windsor Castle. James told me it is included in Henry VIII inventory, so it has been there for 400 years or so. And there are duplicates at Hatfield and Albury. It's Richard, Grant said resignedly. I just don't know anything about faces. Do you know anyone at the BM? At the British Museum? Marta asked, her attention still on the portrait. No, I don't think so. Not that I can think of at the moment. I went there once to look at some Egyptian jewelry when I was playing Cleopatra with Geoffrey. Did you ever see Geoffrey's Antony? It was superlatively genteel, but the place frightens me rather. Such a garnering of the ages. It made me feel the way the stars make you feel, small and of no account. What do you want at the BM? I want some information about the history written in Richard III's day, contemporary accounts. Isn't the sainted Thomas More any good then? The sainted Sir Thomas is nothing but an old gossip, Grant said with venom. He had taken a wild dislike to the much-admired More. Oh, dear, and the nice man at the library seems so reverent about him. The Gospel of Richard III, according to St. Thomas More, and all that. Gospel nothing, Grant said rudely. He was writing down in a Tudor England what someone had told him about events that happened in a Plantagenet England when he himself was 5. 5 years old? Yes. Oh dear, not exactly the horse's mouth. Not even straight from the course. Come to think of it, it is as reliable as a bookie's tips would be. He's on the wrong side of the rails altogether. If he was a Tudor servant, he was on the laying side where Richard III was concerned. Yes, I suppose so. What do you want to find out about Richard when there is no mystery to investigate? I want to know what made him tick. That is a more profound mystery than anything I have come up against as of late. What changed him almost overnight? Up to that moment of his late brother's death, he seems to have been entirely admirable and devoted to his brother. I suppose the supreme honor must always be a temptation. He was regent until the boy came of age, protector of England. With his previous history, you would think that would have been enough for him. You would have thought, indeed, that it would have been very much his cup of tea, guardian of both Edward's son and the kingdom. Perhaps the brat was unbearable, and Richard longed to learn him. Isn't it odd how we never think of victims as anything but white innocents? Like Joseph in the Bible. I'm sure he was a quite intolerable young man, actually, and long overdue for that pushing into the pit. Perhaps young Edward was just sitting up and begging to be quietly put down. There were 2 of them, Grant reminded her. Yes, of course. There isn't an explanation. It was the ultimate barbarism. Poor little woolly lambs. Oh! What was the for? I just thought of something. Woolly lambs made me think of it. Well, no, I won't tell you in case it doesn't come off. I must fly. You have charmed Madeline March into agreeing to write the play? Well, she hasn't actually signed a contract yet, but I think she is sold on the idea. Au revoir, my dear. I shall look in again soon. She went away, sped on her way by a blushing Amazon, and Grant did not remember anything about woolly lambs until the woolly lamb actually turned up in his room next morning. The woolly lamb was wearing horn-rimmed spectacles, which in some odd way emphasized the resemblance instead of detracting from it. Grant had been dozing, more at peace with the world than he had been for some time. History, as Matron had pointed out, an excellent way of acquiring a sense of perspective. The tap at his door was so tentative that he had decided that he had imagined it. Taps on hospital doors are not apt to be tentative, but something made him say, "Come in," and there in the opening was something that was so unmistakably Marta's woolly lamb that Grant laughed aloud before he could stop himself. The young man looked abashed, smiled nervously, propped the spectacles on his nose with a long, thin forefinger, cleared his throat, and said, "Mr. Grant, my name is Carradine, Brent Carradine. I hope I haven't disturbed you when you were resting." No, come in, Mr. Carradine. I'm delighted to see you." "Marta, Miss Hallard, that is, sent me. She said I could be of some help to you." "Did she say how? Do sit down. You'll find a chair over there behind the door. Bring it over." He was a tall boy, hatless, with soft, fair curls crowning a high forehead, and a much too big tweed coat hanging unfastened around him in negligent folds. American-wise. Indeed, it was obvious that he was in fact American. He brought over the chair, planted himself on it with the coat spread round him like some royal robe, and looked at Grant with kind brown eyes, whose luminous charm not even the horn rims could dim. "Marta, Miss Hallard that is, said you wanted something looked up." "And you are a looker-upper?" "I'm doing research here in London, historical research, I mean, and she said something about your wanting something in that line. She knows I work at the BM most mornings. I'd be very pleased, Mr. Grant, to do anything I can to help you." "That's very kind of you, very kind indeed. What is it that you are working on, your research, I mean?" "The Peasants' Revolt." "Oh, Richard II. Yes. You're interested in social conditions?" The young man grinned suddenly in a very unstudent-like way and said, "No, I'm interested in staying in England." "And you can't stay in England without doing research?" "Not very easily. I've got to have an alibi. My pop thinks I should go into the family business. It's furniture, wholesale furniture. You order it by mail, out of a book. Don't misunderstand me, Mr. Grant. It's very good furniture, lasts forever. It's just that I can't take much interest in furnishing units. And short of a polar expedition, the British Museum was the best hideaway you could think of." "Well, it's warm, and I really do like history. I majored in it, and well, Mr. Grant, if you really want to know, I just had to follow Atlanta Shergold to England. She's the dumb blonde in in Miss Hallard's play. I mean, she plays a dumb blonde. She's not at all dumb, Atlanta." "No, indeed, a very gifted woman indeed. You've seen her? I shouldn't think there is anyone in London who hasn't seen her." "No, I suppose not. It does go on, doesn't it? We didn't think, Atlanta and me, that it would run for more than a few weeks, so we just waved each other goodbye and said, 'See you at the beginning of the month.' It was when we found out it was going on indefinitely that I just had to find an excuse to come to England." "Wasn't Atlanta sufficient excuse?" "Not for my pop. The family are very snooty about Atlanta. But Pop is the worst of the bunch. When he can bring himself to mention her, he refers to her as that young Miss Actress acquaintance of yours. You see, Pop is Carradine III, and Atlanta's father is very much Shergold the First. a little grocery store on Main Street, as a matter of fact, and the salt of the earth, in case you're interested. And of course, Atlanta hadn't really done very much back in the States, on the stage. This is her first big success. That is why she didn't want to break her contract and come back home. As a matter of fact, it'll be quite a fight to get her back home at all. She says we never appreciated her. So you took to research. I had to think of something that I could do only in London, you see, and I had done some research at college, so the BM seemed to be that you could call it was my cup of tea. I could enjoy myself and yet show my father that I was really working, both at the same time. Yes, it's a nice alibi as I've ever met with. Why the Peasants' Revolt, by the way? Well, it's an interesting time, and I thought it would please Pop. Is he interested in social reform then? No, but he hates kings. Caradine III? Yes, it's a laugh, isn't it? I wouldn't put it past him to have a crown in one of his safe deposit boxes. I bet he takes out the parcel every now and then and sneaks over to the Grand Central and tries it on in the men's washroom. I'm afraid I'm tiring you, Mr. Grant, gabbing on about my own affairs like this. I didn't come for that. I came to whatever you came for. You're manna straight from heaven. So relax, if you're not in a hurry. I'm never in a hurry, the young man said, unfolding his legs and laying them in front of him. As he did it, his feet at the far extremity of his long limbs touched the bedside table and shook the portrait of Richard III from its precarious position so that it dropped to the floor. Oh, pardon me. That was careless of me. I haven't really gotten used to the length of my legs yet. You'd think a fellow would be used to his growth by 22, wouldn't you? He picked up the photograph, dusted it carefully with the cuff of his sleeve, and looked at it with interest. Richardus III and Rex, he said out loud. You're the first person to have noticed the background writing, Grant said. Well, I suppose it isn't visible unless you look into it. You're the first person I've met who had a king for a pin-up. No beauty, is he? I don't know, said the boy slowly. It's not a bad face, as faces go. I had a prof in college who looked rather like him. He lived on bismuth and glasses of milk, so he had a slightly jaundiced outlook on life. But he was the kindest creature imaginable. Is it about Richard that you wanted information? Yes, nothing very abstruse or difficult, just to know what the contemporary authority is. Well, that should be easy enough. It isn't very far from my own line. I meant my research period. Indeed, the modern authority for Richard II, Sir Cuthbert Oliphant, stretches over both. Have you read Oliphant? Grant said that he had read nothing but school books and Sir Thomas More. More? Henry VIII's Chancellor? Yes. I take it that was a bit of special pleading. I read it to me more like a party pamphlet, Grant said, realizing for the first time that was the taste that had been left in his mouth. It had not read like a statesman's account. It had read like a party throwaway. No, it had read like a columnist who got his information below stairs. Do you know anything about Richard III? Nothing except that he croaked his nephews and offered his kingdom for a horse, and that he had two stooges known as Cat and the Rat. What? You know, the cat, the rat, the Lovell our dog, rule all England under a hog? Of course, I'd forgotten that. What does it mean, do you know? I've no idea. I don't know that period very well. How did you get interested in Richard III? Marta suggested that I should do some academic investigating, since I can't do any practical investigating for some time to come. And because I find faces interesting, and she brought me portraits of all the principals in the various mysteries she suggested. I mean, Richard got in more or less by accident, but he proved the biggest mystery of the lot. He did? In what way? He is the author of the most revolting crime in history, and he has the face of a great judge, a great administrator. Moreover, he was by all accounts an abnormally civilized and well-living creature. He actually was a good administrator, by the way. He governed the north of England and did it excellently. He was a good staff officer and a good soldier, and nothing is known against his private life. His brother, perhaps you know, was Bar Charles II, our most wrench-ridden royal product. Edward IV, yes, I know, a 6-foot hunk of male beauty. Perhaps Richard suffered from a resentment at the contrast, and that accounts for his willingness to blot out his brother's seed. This was something that Grant had not thought of. You're suggesting that Richard had a suppressed hate for his brother? Why suppressed? Because even his worst detractors admit that he was devoted to Edward. They were together in everything from the time that Richard was 12 or 13. The other brother was no good to anyone, George. Who was George? The Duke of Clarence. Oh, him, but of Malmesbury, Clarence. That's the one. So there were just the two of them, Edward and Richard, and there was a 10-year gap in their ages, just the right difference for hero worship. If I were a hunchback, young Carradine said musingly, I sure would hate a brother who took my credit and my women and my place in the sun. It's possible, Grant said after an interval. It's the best explanation I've come on so far. It mightn't have been an overt thing at all, you know. It mightn't have even been a conscious thing. It might just have been all boiled up in him when he saw the chance of a crown. He may have said, his blood may have said, here's my chance. All those years of fetching and carrying and standing on one pace in the rear, and no thanks for them. Here's where I take my pay. Here's where I settle accounts. Grant noticed that by sheer chance Carradine had used the same imagined description of Richard as Miss Payne Ellis, standing one pace in the rear. That is how the novelist had seen him, standing with the fair, solid Margaret and George on the steps of Bayard Castle, watching their father go away to war, one pace in the rear, as usual. That's very interesting, though what you say about Richard being apparently a good sort up to the time of the crime, Carradine said, propping one leg of his horn rims with a long forefinger in his characteristic gesture, makes him more of a person. That Shakespeare version of him, that's just a caricature. Not a man at all. I'll be very pleased to do any investigating you want, Mr. Grant. It'll make a nice change from the peasants. The Cat and the Rat instead of John Ball and Wat Tyler. That's it. Well, it's very nice of you. I'd be glad of anything you can rake up, but at the moment all I pine for is a contemporary account of events. They must have been country rocking events. I want to read a contemporary's account of them, not what someone heard tell about events that happened when he was 5 and under another regime altogether. I'll find out who the contemporary historian is. Fabian, perhaps, or is he Henry VII? Anyway, I'll find out. And meanwhile, perhaps you'd like a look at Oliphant. He's the modern authority on the period, or so I understand. Grant said he would be delighted to take a look at Sir Cuthbert. I'll drop him in when I'm passing tomorrow. I suppose it'll be all right if I leave him in the office for you, and as soon as I find out about the contemporary writers, I'll be in with the news. That suits you? Grant said that was perfect. Young Carradine went suddenly shy, reminding Grant of the woolly lamb which he had quite forgotten in the interest of this new approach to Richard. He said goodnight in a quiet, smothered way, and ambled out of the room, followed by the sweeping skirts of his topcoat. Grant thought that, the Carradine fortune apart, Atlanta Sharegold looked like being on a good thing. The end of chapter 7.